Hello and welcome to this special on the print. Defense Minister Rajnath Singh is currently in the US, where both sides have signed two important agreements. At the same time, Rajnath Singh has also gone ahead and held bilateral talks with his US counterpart as well as with the American NSA. But where does this lead both countries into? And for this, I have with me Akhil Ramesh. He is a director of India Program and Economic Statecraft Initiative at the Pacific Forum. Welcome to the print, Akhil.
Thank you so much for having me, Snehesh.
It's a pleasure. Akhil, straight away, first question. How important is this visit, Rajnath Singh's visit to the US? Or is this just like any standard visit?
No, this is a very important visit for two reasons. One, over the last year or so, there have been multiple incidents, both in the US and in India's neighborhood, that have caused a lot of concern for strategic thinkers like myself looking at the US-India partnership. If it'll stand the test of time, if stressors such as neighborhood geopolitics and certain separatist activities will cost the relationship. So in this environment, the defense minister visiting the US, Washington, and signing these agreements is definitely a great development in the sense that it will rest those concerns.
You mentioned the fact that there are, while the relationship has been booming, from the outside, but internally there have been frictions in the India-US relationship.
Yep.
What are these frictions that you're talking about? And are these very serious frictions that could derail this whole partnership?
So they've been going on forever and ever. Ever since India became independent, the US-India partnership has never had a smooth sailing ride. It was always, there was some tensions or the other. In the 90s, you had the nuclear test that, more like derailed the relationship. And then post that, you had the Kargil, then, US government was taking a position favoring Pakistan. And then ever since, there have been multiple such incidents, including the diplomat Khobragade incident. So the US-India partnership has been tested time and again, but it has always come out in flying colors. That is because whatever the challenges may be, at the top level, at the White House, and at the PMO level in India, I think there's always been an interest to make this relationship work. So as we call it, as I've called it and multiple strategic thinkers are beginning to call it, the US-India partnership is a failure at track 2 and a success at track 1. Track 2, by track 2, we talk about think tanks and I don't want to say media at large, but the discussion, the public discourse, I think is always gets stress tested. But the track 1, government to government, there's the maturity and the conversations they need to have. So it's always success at track 1, but a failure at track 2.
But that's a very interesting perspective that you've mentioned, that India-US ties has been a failure at track 2. And of course, you blame, among many others, you blame the media too. But it has been a success at track 1. Interesting point. So that's a very interesting comment that you've made, a remark saying that India-US ties has been a failure at track 2 dialogue. And of course, you blame many others, including the media, but a success at the track 1 dialogue. And that's a very interesting point. India and the US over the last few years, actually since the Narendra Modi government was sworn in 2014, has signed the 3 foundational agreements that the US was always keen on. And now India and US, on the sidelines of Rajnath Singh's visit, has signed the Security of Supplies Arrangement, Sosa. What exactly is Sosa and how is this beneficial to both the countries?
So the US would like a partner in the Indian Ocean sphere. So the US has, ever since the Monroe Doctrine, different spheres of influence. Indian Ocean has been one that it did not have. And India, for its traditional non-alignment policy and its own strategic autonomy reasons, has had a stronghold over the Indian Ocean region. So it's India's territory and India has its own hegemony in the region. So in this region, US recognizes this hegemony. At the same time, the US wants to support India against its rivals or shared foes, such as China. So that's where things like Sosa come in. I think the US wants to empower India through industrial cooperation, particularly defense industrial cooperation, and through making it a hub for its ships. So these are the two angles that the US is playing with India in this context, both in the Indian Ocean security as a deterrence measure, strengthening India's own deterrence measures, and in the context of defense industrial cooperation.
So, so Sosa is not a binding agreement. What Sosa says is that both countries will prioritize each other's request when it comes to, let's say, platforms to be procured or spare parts components. Am I right?
Yeah, so the thing is, it's always played with if it's binding or not. At the same time, there's also speculations and conspiracies. When this relationship gets tested, whether it's the case of a separatist testing it, or it's a Bangladesh issue testing it, there's always this conspiracy or this speculation that these are the reasons there's the delay in delivery of so-and-so X item. So, I mean, at this stage of the track two, there could always be the speculation, but at track one, there's always the discussion going on. The delays could be out of many variables, many reasons. One can easily attach it to the ongoing geopolitical turmoil, but there's often more things going on in the background, whether it's Russia's S-400s or it's the GE engine from the US. There's always domestic concerns. There's always the industry's internal dynamics that affect it, not just the geopolitics.
Interesting that you mentioned G, and this was my next question to you. Now that a Sosa agreement is signed, the fact is that the G engines for the Tejas Mark 1A the deliveries were supposed to start from March, but not a single engine has been delivered yet. Would an agreement like Sosa ensure that there is timely delivery in future in situations like the current situation we are facing when it comes to the GE engines?
In defense procurement and delivery, I don't think timely will ever will work out. I think there could always be delays, but I think this is one step closer to the timely, in the sense that even though it's not a binding agreement, you still have an agreement in place. So it is a step in the right direction.
A step in the right direction. Yesterday I was talking to someone trying to understand from somebody how would this help, and I was told that this particular deal is about goodwill, right? It's not something which is binding. It's like about the goodwill. If the US wants to do it, they will do it. If the Indians want to do it, they will do it. But interestingly, the other agreement that India and the US are negotiating is the RDP. It's called the Reciprocal Defense Procurement Agreement. Now that becomes a much more solid, legally binding agreement. If an RDP is signed, would India and the US would be able to avoid, or India would be able to avoid a GE kind of a situation engine issue?
So I can't speculate to that. I can't say that they would be able to avoid or not if it'll always be on time. But as you clearly pointed out, it is a goodwill issue. Like I had started off by saying, the last year has been a tough year for the US-India partnership. So you need some good news. So I think the Rajnath Singh meeting with the security leadership is the good news that we were all looking for. But with regards to the distinction, yes, if it is binding, probably. But even then, I would not put all eggs in one basket. Maybe it's not exactly a related topic, but I would go back to India's multi-alignment. Putting all eggs in one defense partnership or counting on one partner for the defense is not India's best option, given its challenges both in West and North. A diversified partnership with different procurement sources is the way to go.
But that's interesting comment coming from you, saying that India's, what India would call it is strategic autonomy, not being part of any side. You think that India is doing the right thing by not being either with the Americans, in bed with the Americans, neither in bed with the Russians for that matter. It has a strategic autonomy that it talks about, and it also acts out.
Oh, yes. I would call it the genius of New Delhi. Some people call it the strategic foolishness, but I would call it their grand strategy that they're practicing. It was just that I go back to my track two failure point. The same thing is practiced by Vietnam, but then there's a praise in media and think tanks saying it is the genius of Vietnamese foreign policy that they've got investment from China, from US, and from India.
Yeah.
If India does the same thing, India doesn't get the praise. It only gets the moral questions, moral posturing, blood on hands, or who has the high ground. So I think India, Vietnam, or all these middle powers in an emerging multipolar world order, I think this is the way to go for these countries, because they can't afford to get caught in the clash between US and China. So I would put it this way. We are an emerging multipolar world order, but not all poles are made equal. US and China are technologically advanced, militarily way more advanced than a middle power such as such as India, Vietnam, or Turkey, or Brazil for that matter. So these countries would have to work with them both, as we've seen with Indian industry now opening up to Chinese businesses, and Indian government also saying we need to welcome foreign direct investment from China. So not just Russia and the US, but India will very soon start working with the Chinese as well.
Well, I can agree to that. The fact is that yes, there is now industrial things have opened up between India and China. It has started happening on this away from the limelight. Now, continuing with this, your our discussion on this strategic autonomy, the fact is that Prime Minister Narendra Modi just met with the Ukrainian President Zelensky. The famous hug. The same hug that he did 1 month back was criticized by the Western world. And even Zelensky, President Zelensky, in his interaction with the Indian media, really was, how should I put it? He really did wish that India becomes more aligned with Ukraine and the Western alliance, and he really wanted India to pick a side. Uh, how do you see this India's relationship with Russia and Modi's visit to Russia, and now Prime Minister Modi's visit to Ukraine?
So I think India's relationship with Russia will remain, but I would call it a slow death. India-Russia relationship is not diversified. They've tried hard to diversify, but besides oil and defense, and also now just oil more so, the relationship has not found a strategic significance in the 21st century. In the 20th century, yes. In the 21st century, I think India is looking to more partners for technology, the West, for alliances that'll help it in multilateral forums, probably in the global South. It'll be the developing countries. With Russia, I think it's limited in that way. I mean, if it was Afghanistan in 2002, one could argue that India-Russia intelligence, the operations they had, was useful. But with post-Afghanistan and with Russia, that is not of 2002 Russia, but much weaker Russia, I think India's relationship with Russia is dying slowly. As far as Ukraine is concerned, naturally, any leader of Ukraine would push India, or for that matter, any country that is, on the fence, to pick their side. It's natural, but will they do it is the next question, and they wouldn't. They have no incentive unless they are part of the Western ecosystem. And if I'm not mistaken, actually, you can fact check me on this, but India is not the only one trading with Russia. Even in the Western, I'm sure there's China and Turkey and others, but there's also a few Western countries still trading with Russia. Over the last 2 years, I think the largest trade volumes were not just India, probably for crude, but for other goods, I think there are European countries still trading with Russia. If I'm not mistaken, I think France still has trade ties with Russia. So I wouldn't say that the West has picked a side. So even if your own best friends or allies haven't picked a side, then you can't force non-aligned and people are on the fence to pick a side.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you on that. This comes to we're running short of time, and I wanted to ask you this question. And this is something which often comes up in discussion, and a lot of people are critical of me when I say this, especially those who are looking at better India-US ties. I'm a strong supporter of India-US ties at the same time.
Mhm.
Is the fact that somehow I feel that despite the growth that both sides have seen, there is still a trust deficit. Maybe it is more at track two rather than at track one. That's an interesting perspective we brought about. But do you think that there's a trust deficit within, when you interact with people from the Indian side and the US side? Do you feel that there is a sense of trust deficit between the two, especially more from India towards the US?
See, I would say seasoned experts or people who are, I wouldn't say old enough, but people who read the history, who know the Bandung Conference, who understand strategic autonomy, non-alignment, they understand the relationship, even within the US government and the Indian government. Yeah. But the track two, I keep going back to it, not just to bash media like it's the norm, but it's not the entire media. So there are people with preconceived notions about what India should be and shouldn't be, what people would call as liberal hegemony. I think that is at the root cause of the problem at the track two level. And sometimes this track two mindset seeps into track one. I don't know if this is true in New Delhi, but in Washington, it's very common for track two to get into track one.
Absolutely.
With the new government, we see people moving from the think tank world into the government sector. So unless you fix track two, fixing track one is going to be hard.
Coming back, I know you would probably not want to get into detail of this, but my last question to you, since it's election time in the US, and of course, you have, the Trump from the Republican side that many in India are hoping that Trump would win. I don't understand why they think so. But in your sense, who would be a better pick as president for India?
So now I'm speaking as just as a strategic thinker, not as a Pacific Forum director, because we are nonpartisan. I want to make that clear. But as far as my analysis goes, Trump is seen as a better pick than Kamala Harris for the sole reason that he favors realism and restraint in foreign policy. We call it as he's not in favor of the neoliberal internationalism that's often subscribed by and also proselytized by Democratic leaders, like Biden's us versus them, Democrat versus not Democrat, and Kamala Harris might be an extension of that. So in that sense, I think Trump is viewed favorably. So he does not care for what happens within India's borders. He's more concerned about what trade deals he can get out of India and what tariffs will Modi cut. I think his priorities are more clear-cut that way. Unlike a Democrat administration that would want to shape India in its own mirror image, which is not necessarily seen positively by many who want to, quote unquote, decolonize India. So,
perfect. That's a good point to end with. But thank you so much for speaking to the print. It's a pleasure to have you on the print, sir.
thank you so much for having me.